Sojourner Truth was clearly an unusual, and I would say even unique woman. And in so many ways that I hope you can see by the time I'm done, a very, very impressive one. But to what degree and exactly what way is really difficult to know. And I would like you to keep that in mind as we go along. Like most former slaves, and most famously Frederick Douglass, there are details of her life that we don't know. And in fact, that she did not know, or that she did not want to share. She comes to us as a result largely through the lens of white America, through people who admired her, people who thought little of her, through support her and literally attack her, through people who were curious about this very unusual woman and thus quite judgmental, through people who claimed to know her but were not really sure. So maybe some actually did. But for whatever reason, she made sure that was the case. And that is a point I'm going to try to make throughout this. So throughout her 86 years, and sometimes she claimed it to be longer than that, she spoke her mind, but that's a mind we really don't always know what she was saying. So what do we know about her? She traveled and walked across much of the northern United States. She did literally verbal battle with people who mocked her. She spoke out on issues that mattered to her that most of the rest of the country did not share her views. She talked from the Bible. She talked from her personal connection with God. And she talked plain old common truth, plain old common sense as she saw it. But again, it comes to us mainly through white audiences. So I really would like that to be uppermost. And this is a woman that we're still trying to know. Let me start moving myself along here if I can do this. To understand Sojourner Truth, we need to remember that while northern states had abolished slavery in the late 1700s and early 1800s, so she had a life of slavery and freedom, and that the rest of the country was without slavery beginning in 1865, racism was very much alive and well throughout her life. And so too was sexism, and so too was classism. She didn't fall into the categories of people that got admiration and respect. She often got kind of a looking down from those who saw themselves as better than she. So the woman we know as Sojourner Truth lived and preached, and preaching was a very important part of her life, in a time and in a place, and that is the northern United States, that limited what women and Blacks and certainly slaves could do and how they were seen. That affected how she thought, how she spoke, how she lived, and thus how her story is known to us. So who was Sojourner Truth? And call your attention to the, the bus that was celebrated in 2009 and what Michelle Obama said. That children, for example, will hear the story of Sojourner Truth who didn't allow indignities, and that goes back to what I just said, to destroy her spirit, who fought for her own freedom. It wasn't given to her, she took it, and then used her powers to help others, her power of thinking and singing and arguing, who fought for the right to vote and the rights of all women, but also of all people, Black and white, former slave or not. She is freedom to some who visit the many monuments to her throughout the United States. She is also liberty and equal rights for African Americans and women. She is assertiveness and pride. She is everything that you might want to pick that would be admirable. She was without a doubt an impressive speaker and debater, but in some ways more a storyteller and an inspiration. She combined hard work, opportunities to speak, her stories, going to court, God's message as she understood it, song, and even her striking physical appearance and her voice, both of which were very unusual. Enough to have a congresswoman's cat named after her. I'm a cat person, so that really struck me. A Mars rover bear her name, and a Norwegian airliner bear her name and image. Innumerable children's books and paper dolls. A biography, still the only major one, by one of the nation's most respected historians. A Google Doodle, I had to learn that word. A day in her honor in Michigan. Schools, libraries, housing projects, you name it, named after her. Statues, museums, memorials, all of this for a woman that many people don't even know existed. They don't. Sojourner Truth, what's that? All of this to indicate the importance of what she did in her 86 years. So we know that Sojourner Truth did not look, sound, or behave like women or slaves or free blacks were supposed to, but we have to try to figure out who she was anyway. To the mid and early 1800s white American, she was unfeminine, exotic, deviant. She was disgusting, a curiosity, grotesque. All of these were words used about her. And some, believe it or not, in a kind of positive way. She violated norms. She could be angry, she could be humorous, but whatever, she grabbed attention. She performed. And very deliberately, she performed. And she spoke to people, white and black, men and women, that was not common for a woman, certainly a black woman, to do. And she did things in terms of lawsuits, in terms of challenging laws that people did not do at that time. So let's look at where she came from. She came from New York, as you all undoubtedly know, but she came from Dutch New York. She came from the New Netherlands area, or the colony that was established by the Dutch in the early 1600s, and the first slaves arrived from Africa in the mid 1620s. What they did, as these images, I hope, kind of indicate, is they worked, not surprisingly, but they worked in an area that was being created, that was being colonized. They cleared land, they split logs, they milled lumber, they built fortifications, they built roads, they built wharves, everything to establish the Dutch colony. Within a few decades, they were allowed to have what was called half freedom. They could live largely free lives, but they were always controlled by the Dutch West Indies Company to do whatever labor was needed. So while they were recognized as integral parts of the New Netherlands colony, they were also seen as unequal and inferior. But then the English came in the mid 1600s, and that actually meant more diversity in what they did, but also more restrictions, more severe punishment, less opportunity. The Dutch Americans held on to their slaves largely, and those are going to be some more intensely slave-held areas of New York. But New York, under the English, changed things. As one historian, Shane White, has said, New York slavery may have been small scale, 1 to 2 to 3 to 5 slaves, and centered on the family farm rather than the plantation, the large numbers in the southern colonies. But it was also implacable, brutal, and little short of devastating on its impact on the Black family. As another historian said, it had nasty edges to it. And that is going to make New York slavery a little different from that of the other northern colonies. New York in 1700, 42% of households owned slaves. Maybe 1 or 2, but owned slaves. Only Charleston, South Carolina had something comparable to that. And that is looking at what we define as where the slaves were, the southern colonies, the southern states. By the mid 1700s, it had more slaves by percentage and by number than any colony north of Maryland. In addition, it had a thriving slave trade. and the slave market in New York was famous. Also famous was the alleged conspiracy of slaves and free blacks in the 1740s that resulted in the execution, the burning at the stake of accused slaves. What were they doing in New York? Well, they were doing what they did in many areas of the North. They were served as house servants. They worked in manufacturing. They had skilled jobs. They were artisans. They were blacksmiths, carpenters, shoemakers, butchers. They also had a lot of unskilled work, and they worked on in shipping and in commerce on the ships that went out to sea to transport goods back and forth. To give you an idea, I'm not really good at New York geography. I'm working on it. But this is the area that this map is representing over here. And what this map does, and I tried to make it as clear as possible, and it's from this article in case you wanted to know more, but in the dark, dark areas, 1 in 3 households own slaves. And you can see down here when you get down to uh, the New York City area, the Manhattan area. But if you look at the other ones, you still have 1 in 3 to 1 in 5, so 20 to 30% or 50% or whatever, it varied in these areas. So you get an idea of where the slaves were. And most of them were in areas that had a significant Dutch influence in them. In fact, where Sojourner Truth was born, it was a Dutch area, Ulster County, and it was Dutch speaking. So English was a second language for her, as we'll see. Most of the people who owned slaves, and I think it's important to keep in mind when you compare it to the South and the experience, the opportunity, I guess you would say, that slaves had. In the South, on larger plantations, and most of them didn't have 200 to 300, but they still had 20 maybe or so slaves. There's a greater opportunity to have an African shared or slave shared life with some kind of opportunity to grow up and be somebody other than a slave. You were part of a family. In areas where there were only 1 or 2 or 3 slaves per household, and these farms were separated, it meant that there was a lot of, and I don't mean to overstate this, but identification and self-definition that came from the whites, from the slave owners. So what happened, in part thanks to the American Revolution, was a lot of rethinking about slavery and a lot of assertiveness on the part of slaves for their freedom and free blacks for opportunity. Some served in the American Revolutionary, the Continental Army, and others served in the British Army upon offer of freedom if they fought for their freedom and for the continued subjugation, I guess you'd call that, of the American revolutionaries. It sparked a lot of thinking about natural rights. It also sparked, once the Americans won, some changes in the economy. Virginia, for example, was already moving from tobacco, which required large scale of unskilled workers, to grain, a grain economy, which required much fewer slaves. And that, unfortunately, is going to lead to the selling of many of those unneeded slaves farther south. So all of this is going to prompt changes in the northern colonies. But as you can see from this image here, while some were freeing their slaves as early as 1777, 1780, New York did not free its slaves or begin the process, because in New York, it's gradual emancipation. In Massachusetts, it was done. In New York, it's going to be gradual over decades. And this will give you an idea that in 1790, New York had almost 20,000 slaves, which was more than Georgia, which was the newest of the southern colonies. That number is going to grow quite quickly. And certainly the number is nothing compared to Virginia's, which is creeping up on 200,000. But if you look at what was remaining in some of these areas, you have New York really, really standing out as a slave-owning colony, or now a slave-owning state. However, the gradual emancipation, as this indicates, shows that there is a decline. New York is not going to fully end its slavery until really almost 1830. And you can see how the numbers reflect that here, just as other areas are growing in their numbers of slaves. Okay. So let's shift over finally to Sojourner Truth. And she was born in Ulster County, and these images give you some idea of exactly where in Ulster County she was born. She was sold for the first time when she was 9 years old, and she had 5 owners, sometimes having difficulty understanding that this little girl spoke Dutch, not English, was whipped in cases for not understanding instructions and not speaking English. And I'm going to use this chart to kind of guide us through a variety of things. She was one of, apparently, born in 1797, we think that's the best date. She was one of 10, 11, or 12 children of James and Elizabeth Bomfrey. Don't really know much about them. New York did not allow slave marriages to be recognized or to be part of the legal practice in the children legitimate until I think it was 1809, but many localities did allow slave marriages, did record them, did allow the ceremony, unlike in the South, where that identity was never permitted. But her siblings, she knew, I believe one, she met a couple of later when she was an adult and went to New York, but her siblings were sold away. She was called Belle. Her name was Isabella Bomfrey, but she was called Belle apparently fairly widely. She grew to be a tall girl, and we're going to talk about her height in a little bit. She was also seen as a very strong, capable worker. And her last owner, John Dumont, valued her and praised her for being even a better worker than the men on his plantation, his farm. Don't want to use that word, which also can mean farm, but it kind of gives us images of what was going on in the South. She planted corn, she hoed, she picked stones out of the fields. She was a strong, capable worker who prided herself on that and wanted to meet John Dumont's image of her. And that actually causes some problems in trying to understand who she was before she reimagined herself as Sojourner Truth when she was in her mid-40s. She did not learn how to read and write. It was not illegal to teach slaves that in New York, but she never learned how to read and write. She explained later, the letters all got mixed up and I couldn't straighten them out. Did that mean some form of dyslexia? We don't know. She would say later, I can't read a book, but I can read people. You read books, God himself talks to me. That could be perhaps a way of her turning a disadvantage into an advantage. There were children who tried to teach her how to read. There were comments about she just doesn't get it. Was there a learning disability? Was there maybe an injury due to her treatment or work as a slave? We don't know. All we know is she remained illiterate her entire life, which helps to explain what I said earlier, that what we have about her is through other people. They wrote down what she said. She dictated her narrative to somebody. How accurate is that narrative from what she dictated? Were some words changed that really affected meaning? We don't know. We don't know. We know that her mother guided her in a belief in God and in a kind of religious instruction, but her movement later toward Methodism and to kind of some of the Reform churches, almost, well, in one case, a cult group, were her own movement in thinking about what she should do with her life. And that came after she was a slave. But anyway, when she was a teenager, she had a relationship with a young slave on another farm. That was stopped by his owner. and she wound up marrying a slave on the Dumont farm, and she had 5 children that we know of. We know the names, we know the sexes of 4 of them. We don't know the 5th. The standard guess is it was a son who may have died in childbirth, or, I mean, we don't know. Later in life, while she was traveling, she actually met a young woman who said she was her daughter, a missing daughter. So maybe this was a daughter, maybe this daughter was taken from her. We don't know. Again, Reed is trying to piece together what happened. What we do know from her narrative is that she developed a great deal of fondness for John Dumont, even though he punished her harshly at times. We also know that there was some issue with his wife, Sally. We don't know what it is because she didn't say. She just said that there were some wrong and unnatural things done by Sally Dumont. Was that some sort of sexual abuse? We don't know. Like I said, there's a lot we don't know about her, but all of these things clearly affected her. We do know that when what New York did, and I think I have a slide setting this up. Okay, this is the newest monument statue going up to her later this year. We do know that in the late 1790s, New York passed a gradual emancipation act. And what it did is it said that children born after 1799 were going to have their freedom. When the male child became 28, when the female child became 25. That excluded Sojourner Truth, who was born before then, and it excluded her parents, for example. New York, however, changed the law in 1817 and said that slavery would be over in 1827. That would be it for everybody. She made a deal with John Dumont that she would have her freedom slightly before that because of all the labor she did. However, she hurt her hand, and he reneged on the deal and said that he didn't get the correct payment in terms of her labor for him. Her response to that, or her explanation of that in her narrative, is pretty telling. The slave owners are terrible for promising to give you this or that if you do thus and so. And when the time of fulfillment comes and one claims the freedom, they, forsooth, recollect nothing of the kind. And you are, like as not, taunted with being a liar. Or at best, the slave is accused of not having performed his part or condition of the contract. So what she decided to do is she was just going to leave. He broke the deal. She was going to, as she put it, play. So she took baby Sophia with her and she left. And she found support. She found support from a neighboring family, the Van Wagenens, who in time paid John Dumont's, I don't know the amount, but a small amount of money for her last months and for the baby, who was going to be free anyway. And that is the beginning of a very interesting future for her, because as she walks away in 1826, and in the 1850s is when we know that she starts seriously preaching and advocating against slavery, for better rights and for women's rights. We know some things happened in here. We know that she lived and worked in the neighboring areas. She went to court to rescue her little boy, Peter, who had been sold into slavery in the South. She increasingly was preaching at camp meetings. In living in New York, she did not associate closely with the developing Black community, as it was called, and she joined a cult group. Then later, let's see if I can make it go. In 1843, she's going to change her name. She's going to expand her preaching. She's going to move to Florence, Massachusetts with a reform group. Then later in the 1840s, she's going to move to 1850, moved to Battle Creek, Michigan, of all places. And in 1850, she's going to dictate her narrative. So there's a lot that goes on in this like quarter century of her life. So let's look at a couple of things because they were so defining about her renaming, but also I think rethinking who she was. Slaves under the New York gradual emancipation process were not to be sold out of New York. That was not going to be a loophole to get out of freeing slaves in New York. But that's what happened to her little boy, Peter, who was about 6 years old. And through a multi-step process, he wound up in a plantation in Alabama. When she knew of this, she fought it. She got help from Quaker families. She got help from John Dumont. She got help from whoever she needed. And they were able to find lawyers. And she took this case to court. And the judge ruled that the child was hers and had to be returned to her. The judge said the boy should be delivered into the hands of the mother, having no other master, no other controller, no other conductor but his mother. And she had argued with the wife of the slave owner that she was the mother. And she had argued with others, she was the mother. And that gave her rights that others did not have. And she was kind of brushed aside in her arguments. And when her son Peter was returned to her, very difficult for him because he had been physically and obviously emotionally abused, just 6, 7 years old. And she had to kind of reestablish herself with him as his mother. And she had kind of wished God's punishment on the people who had taken the child as a slave. She found out soon afterwards that not only had the man who had taken her child beaten him, he had also soon after that beat his wife to death. And that is something that made her kind of feel guilty, feel badly about, because that is not what she wanted. But the fact that she had asked for God's help to get her son back helped convince her that she did have this relationship with God, and that personal connection is going to be very important to her. And she is going to become increasingly involved with various splinter groups, I guess you would call it, that were involved with a concept known as perfectionism, that involved living a particularly spotless life to be ready for the second coming. And that involved, even for women, preaching. It involved taking care of the disadvantaged, focusing on social issues. They were seen as extremists in this time of reform and utopian movements, but this was very much part of how she was kind of rethinking her life. It also got her caught up in this kingdom of Matthias. And those of you from New York are way more familiar with the New York geography, but it's in the Sing Sing area, which was actually, the prison was being built about the same time. This is a mainly white cult, and I think that's probably the best word for it. He was a down and out carpenter who decided that he was the spokesman, the representative, the embodiment of Christ and others. And the cult kind of swung kind of towards sexual experimentation. She was not part of that. But Matthias is going to get linked to a murder case because one of the men who donated property and was part of this was killed. And Matthias is going to be charged with his murder. Isabella is going to be charged with playing a part in this. And she is going to, he's going to be tried for murder, and she's going to sue for slander. She's going to take this white couple to court. Now, to be able to do that, she had to have some status before the law. And Blacks were not seen as particularly honest, trustworthy, honorable. So she had to get white men to speak for her. And one of the people she asked, and one of the people who spoke for her was John Dumont. And she won, I think it was something like $150 in this lawsuit, which of course doesn't sound like much to us today, although after a year of dealing with COVID, $150 can be extremely helpful for a lot of people. It probably equated to probably close to about $90,000 in terms of what that $150 meant based on people's salaries and status in society. So what she had done is taken care of her family, taken care of her name, taken care of who she was. And I think most people say that what this did is help inspire her to see herself not as somebody defined by a master, somebody defined by somebody of another race, somebody defined by a free status versus her slave or dependent status, but somebody who had something to say, somebody who had a purpose in life to make. And so this is when she changes her name. And sojourner, most people I don't think use that term anymore, but if you look at the legal history of slaves in this period, northern states had laws regarding people who traveled in their states with their slaves. And in order to have a relationship and a union, they allowed sojourners to bring their slaves into the state. And a sojourner was somebody who was there temporarily, somebody who was there for a short period of time and would be moving on. And thus, if they had slaves with them, not trying to establish slavery or reestablish slavery. So as a preacher, as somebody who was going to go where she was needed, sojourner was a name that made sense. And of course, as she saw it, she was speaking the truth against slavery, for rights, for women. And so this was a name that made a great deal of sense for her. And what she did is she took her name up the Hudson, stuck on Hudson, on the Connecticut River Valley to Massachusetts. And this is not a map of her travels, and it's not a map intending to say this is everywhere she went. But I did want to show you, at least on the scale of where we travel today, some of the places that were major in her life. New York, Massachusetts, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. Ohio is where she gave one of her more famous speeches. Michigan is where she moved and lived the final years of her life. So you get a sense of the distance. And this is a woman who walked a lot of that. This is a woman who went into areas. Indiana didn't have slaves, but Indiana prohibited Blacks from being in the state. And she challenged that. She challenged some of the restrictions on based on race as she went about her time. But anyway, she went to Florence, Massachusetts, which was I don't know if you call it a hot spot, but certainly a center of abolitionism, to work for a group, the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, which was another one of those utopian communities that focused on a variety of things: racial, gender, economic equality, class, race, and sex. And she lived in a factory boarding house. She was a supervisor over white men and women. She met some famous abolitionists, including William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, who probably didn't think a whole lot more of her than she thought of him, but I can get to that. And she felt a real sense of equality and freedom, not just of her behavior, but her thinking. And this is going to start or really intensify this movement of her to be heard. She always dressed plainly. This was part of a broader religious belief she had. An apron, a shawl, a bonnet, or a turban of some sort. This is not how ladies were supposed to dress. And she didn't even dress the way respectable Black women trying to assert their equality might have in places like Philadelphia, which was a center of a growing free Black population. She also was really tall. She didn't walk genteelly. She didn't speak genteelly. She's just different. And give you an idea. Got some statistics here that, of course, do not reflect everybody, but gives you some idea. The mean height of female slaves, at least in this 50 years using ship information, was 5'3", and I think the average height of American women today is 5'4", so it's probably not that much different if you go mean and average. And men is 5'7", and I couldn't find a little image that showed men's height at 5'7", and I didn't want to tinker with it because it would probably distort things. But Sojourner Truth was 6 feet tall. And a 6 foot tall woman today is going to stand out. We're all going to say, "Oh, you play basketball." It's going to be that stereotype. Most women fall much shorter than that. So here you have this 6 foot tall, dark skinned, kind of Dutch accented English speaker who is illiterate, dressed plainly, asserted herself, invited or uninvited into places, and she is going to be an attention grabber. And clearly, for some people, that meant they didn't take her seriously. They could listen to her without feeling they had to take her seriously. For others, it made them take her seriously. And so when she dictated her narrative in 1850, she became a standout person. She became somebody that drew attention, particularly in the abolitionist newspapers. And I do want to emphasize that abolitionism was not anti-slavery. There were a lot of people who opposed slavery, but that meant then you get all the blacks out of this country. And you can oppose slavery without supporting any version of Black equality or Black rights or Black opportunities. The abolitionists were, again, the kind of radical left, I guess you'd call them, maybe 5% of the country. If you were an abolitionist, you were barred largely from the South, but you were also attacked, mocked, and imprisoned, killed in one case if you were in the North. So the North is not some sort of paradise for former slaves or paradise for people who supported them. And her book was part of the story of a very different area of slavery. Frederick Douglass, of course, talked about Maryland. He talked about escaping slavery. Harriet Jacobs, whose book came out right at the start of the Civil War, hid in an attic for 7 years to avoid being turned into the sexual slave on top of the physical slave of a white owner. Sojourner Truth's story is so much different. I want to show you this. This is the only writing that apparently exists of Sojourner Truth. And this is apparently her effort to sign her name. So to emphasize her illiteracy, it's not just reading, it is writing. And you get an idea of how difficult it is then to put together her story when you have it only coming through white America. But she gave speeches. She gave a lot of them. And that helps us have some sort of idea of who she was. So I'm going to just read some of what people said. Now, admittedly, most of these are from pro-abolition or sympathetic writers. She throws out gems of thought. Sojourner Truth, the poor old slave woman, she would be in her mid-50s by this time, reviewed the previous sermon with a power of discrimination I never in my life saw exceeded, if equaled. In the terrible crucible of her criticism, she melted it down and down until it was shown to be nothing to what it was claiming. Though unable to read one word, she exhibited a power of rude but keen analysis, such as most professional critics must covet in vain. She appeals not unfrequently in a way that electrified the congregation in a manner not to be described. Sojourner Truth presented in quaint and homely form truths that will perchance be longer remembered than if they've been clothed in the most eloquent language. She led off in words that scathed like the very lightnings. Truth would sometimes throw in the way of the politicians a most ugly difficulty, a whole argument with premise, conclusion, application in a single sentence. She made one of her choice short speeches full of rich thoughts and marked by her confiding faith in truth and her earnest love of humanity. If there was no other count in the indictment against slavery than this, that it had doomed such a soul as hers to the lifelong robberies and sorrows of slavery, it were enough to doom the policy of any church or party that should consent to such an outrage upon a human soul. Sojourner Truth, a colored woman, once a slave, spoke and gratified her audience highly. She showed that beneath her dark skin and uncomely exterior, there was a true womanly heart. She uttered some truths that told well. She said woman set the world wrong by eating the forbidden fruit, and now she was going to set it right. Keep that point in mind. She said goodness never had any beginning. It was everlasting and can never die. She expressed great reverence for God and faith that he will bring about his own purposes and plans. With her long, bony arms, she presents an appearance at once grotesque and ludicrous, but yet inspiring a degree of respect that commands attention. Finally, she carries not only a tongue of fire, but a heart of love. Shift gears a little bit, back to her point about women. This monument, this statue that went up to Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady, sorry, I have to move this because it's going to get in my way if I don't move you guys at some point. Okay, just a second. This statue here, sorry, I got off track, includes Sojourner Truth. She was added because women's rights, of course, whether it's voting or education or just being allowed to be heard and seen in public, also involved Black women, although they were often excluded by the white reformers. And this leads to a controversial situation here. She gave a speech in Ohio in 1851, where she made her famous "And Ain't I a Woman" speech. We don't really know what she said, because at the time, a man, Marius Robinson, published an account of what she said about a month later, and it was much briefer. And it did say "Ain't I a Woman," but it was much briefer. 12 years later, a leader in the women's rights movement, Frances Dana Gage, gave a much longer, and you can look for it, you can find it in the newspapers, a much longer version of what she said that had the repetition of "Ain't I a Woman." Which one is accurate? Which one did she really say? The things I have found by looking at the old newspapers are much briefer, might be longer than what you're going to hear in a minute, but it was much briefer. I don't know. I can imagine her saying both of them. This is what Gage said. She said, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns and no man could help me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? And if I don't do this, there we go. I have borne 13 children, as far as we know, far off the mark, and seen most of them sold off into slavery. When I cried out, with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. Ain't I a woman?" Is that what she said? I mean, we don't know. Part of the difficulty, I think, is because this repetition has really inspired people and really made people listen. It's also been read by numerous major actresses and just people who are skilled at reading. And oftentimes they have a Southern accent to this, and it really has an impact when you have that. But remember, her first language was Dutch, and she never lived or moved in the South. So what you can actually find if you do a little digging here, there is a Sojourner Truth project. And one of the things they've tried to do is find Dutch Americans who can read at least the short version I found. And this is maybe how she would have sounded. So I'm going to play this for you.
"Well, children, where there's so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says women need to be help into carriages and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into a carriage. All over mud puddles or gives me the best place. Ain't I a woman?
There are numerous versions of this.
Well,
Hold it. There's numerous versions. I like that one because the voice strikes me as probably more like hers from the things I have read. But you might want to check the Sojourner Truth project.com, I believe. And you can listen to various ones as they try to bring her more to life. Her speaking led into the Civil War, and this is a mural that depicts African-American soldiers in that war. It's about 180,000 of them fought. Her grandson, one of her grandsons, fought for the 54th Massachusetts, famed in the movie Glory. She also helped in the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington. She worked to help the people who were streaming into Washington, D.C., seeking their freedom. And she also saw the need for doing something for them after the war. And a big part of what she wanted was for them to have land and education. And those are going to be two things that she is going to continue to work for after the Civil War. She dies in 1883, so that gives her about 20 years to have some of these continued campaigns. Now, this is another case that I want to emphasize because it adds to this idea of asking questions about who she is. This obviously is not a photograph, and I did try to give you some information. A painter put these two images together. The painting was destroyed, but somebody had taken a photograph, so we have that. She did meet Abraham Lincoln. Her account of it, her narrative, by the way, is going to be reissued numerous times into the 1870s. And additional information is going to be added to it. But her account of this meeting, as she dictated, was of a Lincoln that was very familiar with her, very praising of her, very polite with her, very optimistic and encouraging. And they had a conversation where she said she knew of him and he said that he knew of her. And she thanked him for the Emancipation Proclamation, and he talked about the opposition to it, and there was this exchange. The white woman who set up this meeting with Lincoln had a very, very different account of it. He pretty much was in a good mood until he saw her and was like, I don't want to deal with this person. He made some abrupt, brusque comment to her and then showed her out the door. That there was really no contact. If that's the case, if that's what happened, that's really not too surprising as I see it. She was building a case for Black rights after the war. And I would argue, if it was the case, taking advantage of linking herself and the issues and the causes to somebody like Lincoln, whose name would have a positive impact on whatever she was doing. One of the things she wanted was to have land in the West for African-American settlement. She actually started putting together petitions using the impact of her name to get signatures. That never got to Congress, but that was something she was working on. And a man named Pat Singleton will really engage in this in the 1870s in the so-called Exoduster movement. She also kept pushing for women's voting. Men, of course, Black men got the right to vote, or the right not to have it denied in the 15th Amendment, but she was pushing for women's voting, and she did try to vote in 1872 for Ulysses Grant for his second term, and she was turned away. However, I love this. Her tombstone is not covered the way Elizabeth Cady Stanton is, for example, but apparently this is from 2020, that they have had to put a plastic film or something over her tombstone to keep it from being damaged by the material on the stuff that's on these stickers, or that has to be used to clean the tombstones. Just to kind of get her to her last years, she left Florence, Massachusetts for Michigan, and she wound up buying some land just outside of Michigan, outside of Battle Creek, and then moved to Battle Creek. And that's where she lived with daughter, grandsons, sons-in-law, all of that. And they are buried at the Oak Hill Cemetery. I did a search just recently on, I think it's called Cemetery Travel or Travel Cemetery. And it's really a wonderful write-up of her as the key person at this cemetery. Very well done. But this is the tombstone that they have there. Born a slave in Ulster County, New York in the 18th century, they don't know when, died in Battle Creek, Michigan. November 26th is her day in Michigan. Aged about 105, probably playing off of her exaggerations. And then this final line in Is God Dead? And probably Ain't I a Woman and Is God Dead is her two famous lines. And that came in her little discussion with, I think I have it here, with Frederick Douglass. His comment was, she seemed to feel it her duty to ridicule my efforts to speak and act like a person of cultivation and refinement. She was a genuine specimen of the uncultured Negro. She cared very little for elegance in speech or refinement of manners. Didn't quite click with each other. But he was giving a speech, and as you might know, he was not a fan of the 4th of July as a real holiday for African Americans. He had a very famous speech where he talked about the 4th of July is for white Americans. And that is often read even today for 4th of July or 5th of July ceremonies. And in one of the times where he was going up and down and was kind of down in terms of hopefulness about what this country would do with slavery and after slavery, he just sounded so down. Her response to him from the audience is God dead? Because if he's not, you should not be hopeless. You know, God is there and he will see us through all of this. So I would like to end, because you can go on forever talking about things she said or things we think she said. She's not the first African-American woman who played a part. We can go back to Phyllis Wheatley, the poet, and certainly Harriet Tubman, who's in the center of the screen there. Black women have played major roles in American history, often on the local level, in schools, in communities, in self-help groups, in churches for sure. And they haven't always been national or public figures, and certainly haven't always been ones that have been written about and studied. Sojourner Truth is increasingly one of the exceptions, the person with the national reputation and has been increasingly studied. However, I want to add something. When she died, a young man, T. Thomas Fortune, who's going to become a major African-American editor in the early 20th century, noted that although the name of Sojourner Truth is familiar to many people in 1883, not more than one colored person out of 10 knows who she is. And if you broaden that to maybe not more than one colored or one person out of 10 knows who she is, might sadly even be the truth still today. A big part of that is she was from the North, not the South. She's not part of this horrible story of Southern slavery and the Civil War. Also, she didn't escape slavery. She walked away. She didn't return to slavery as Harriet Tubman did, risking her life every single time to save people from it. She walked away. She used the court system. She made songs. She delivered, I would call, punchlines. She stopped debaters dead in their tracks. So I'm not really sure after all of this who she was, but regardless, what we know and what we think we know says a great deal about her. And it says a great deal about us and our desire to see her for maybe what she wasn't seen as at the time, as this strong, powerful, thoughtful, creative, intelligent woman. Shirley Chisholm, the congresswoman from New York who ran for the presidential nomination in 1972, defined herself as unbought and unbossed. And maybe that wasn't Sojourner Truth in her first years, but I think it certainly was her in her later years. And so I think we see her now as somebody who fought battles and won battles for her rights, for other rights, for other lives, for their country, and for everyone's freedom. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions that I could answer, I will be happy to answer them.